So before we dive into our talk, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the women who have sacrificed so much during this unprecedented year. As the COVID-19 pandemic ripped through our country, so many women have left good careers or lost meaningful jobs so they could meet the needs of their children who went to school through a screen, vulnerable relatives sheltering in place, loved ones who needed comfort, having suffered tremendous loss. I think we would all agree that the strength of the fairer sex has carried us through these immensely difficult times. So I've been asked to talk about two things today, the past and the present. And I am going to be faithful to my assignment, as it is Women's History Month after all. I first want to talk about a woman who so perfectly captures the title of our talk today, She Who Would Not Be Silenced. When I saw that topic, the woman who came to mind immediately was Sojourner Truth. For one, her name says it all. After freeing herself from slavery, she literally walked away from her slave master in New York. She renamed herself Sojourner Truth, because in her travels, her sojourns, of which she would have many, she spoke the truth. And the reason why, to me, she captures so perfectly this topic is that no matter what confronted her, she kept speaking truth to power in courts of law and in the courts of public opinion. Perhaps her greatest moment in this regard was her first, when she won the freedom of her youngest son, Peter. Peter, just 5 years old, was snatched from Sojourner and sold by Sojourner's former slave owner as retribution because she walked away. So Sojourner, in response, took to the courts. Remarkably, in 1826, a newly self-manumitted, brown-skinned woman who could not read or write had the strength and foresight to swear out a warrant for the slave owner's appearance in the Ulster County Court so that she could petition the judge for the return of her son. Sojourner then convinced not one, but two lawyers to help her fight for Peter's freedom. Although the official outcome of the case remains undocumented because the parties settled, Peter returned to New York and was freed ultimately on July 4th of his manumission year. Sojourner Truth in that moment used the law and her voice to be the most powerful of change agents. From there, Sojourner spends the next 6 decades amassing a remarkable following, packing audiences to hear her on so many topics: abolition, temperance, suffrage, Jesus, the law. Among her last causes, when Sojourner was well into her 80s, she fought to secure reparations for freed slaves living in Washington, D.C. By this time, Sojourner carried what she called her book of life, and whomever she met, of note or not, she would have them sign her book of life. So many of the entries described how people had to literally carry Sojourner, ailing and well into her 80s, from one speech to another, where she urged statesmen, politicians, benefactors to petition for granting tracts of land to freed Black DC residents so they could lift themselves out of poverty and become self-sustaining. In reading her book of life, it became plain that Sojourner's beginnings as that fierce protectress of her own boy played out over and over again in her fight for racial equity and social healing for the Black community. This, I believe, is one of the most moving aspects of her struggle, how her deep desire to spare her boy from a life of trauma was the rocket fuel that ignited her mission to be in the service of others. Now to the present. I am not going to compare myself to Sojourner Truth, but her story does make me focus on one question. What was my rocket fuel? For me, it was my mom. My mom's story starts out like many in America, As the daughter of immigrants, Greeks from Egypt and Turkey, Mom did not have time to be a kid. There was always work to do. So as she told it, the best time in her life was that sweet spot of youth. Too young to have a care, too old to be told what to do. And when she was in her early 20s, she was a budding artist. She designed her own clothes. She had many boyfriends and a great job. She, to put it bluntly, had no use for settling down. Then in a blink, it all ended. Laughing with her friends in a car, sailing down the highway one minute, T-boned with her head wedged between the car seat and the door the next. From this devastating accident, Mom developed a massive blood clot on her brain. She spent 3 months in a coma, and then she became one of the first patients to have her body deep frozen to slow down the blood flow so the surgeons could drill 3 holes in her skull, reach in, and remove the clot. She next went through 5 years of intensive rehabilitation and received pennies in a legal settlement that was spent before the check was cut. So my mom's life had 2 chapters, before the accident and after. I lived only with after the accident mom. And that mom was depressed, anxious. I strongly suspect that she had what we now call PTSD, but back then there wasn't a name for it, and certainly no counseling to treat the fallout of a catastrophic brain injury. So she smoked and drank to calm her nerves. She still made beautiful art, but she had so many fears. She was scared to travel, to drive, sometimes even to leave the house. And as I grew older, it became harder and harder for her to bottle up that resentment of having been robbed of everything, while she watched me do all the things she was meant to do. And as a little kid, all I wanted was for her to get better. I remember thinking, if I got good grades or starred in that school play, maybe she wouldn't be so sad. But she never did get better. And no matter how hard I tried, I just didn't have the tools to help her. So there's no doubt that my mom's struggle became one very important reason why I did what I did as a lawyer, and I know she influences how I am on the bench. I remember preparing for my Senate confirmation hearing, where I had to take stock of my legal career, and I realized I had represented so many people who suffered from traumatic brain injury. In my civil practice, I represented brain-injured children poisoned in a lead paint study, a 39-year-old man who suffered a massive stroke after a police officer put him in a chokehold during a traffic stop, patients at a drug rehab center poisoned by carbon monoxide. Taking the long view, I realized that in each one for whom I fought like hell as their attorney, a piece of that fight was for my mom. As a public defender, many of the same emotions moved me. I now see I ran toward the work to offer a modicum of protection for the injured, those who suffered from the trauma of poverty, abuse, and neglect so profound it often explained their serious legal predicaments. Growing up with my mom made me very sensitive to that. And I now see that every time I stood up in court to make seemingly impossible arguments or stood with my clients when they received decades-long prison sentences, that I had been specially fortified to do the work because I grew up with my mom. Mom is also very much with me on the bench, and not because I can still hear her voice telling me I need a haircut or that purple is not in my color wheel. She is with me most obviously in criminal sentencings. I try really hard to acknowledge the trauma that crime visits on victims, their families, and communities, but also the trauma that punishment visits on the defendants, their families, and their communities. Because that's the reality of even the most fair just and necessary prison sentences. And I do believe we have to look at that head on and, in my view, enrich the programming that's aimed toward rehabilitation and reintegration on the other end of prison. Or we risk making no real progress in breaking that vicious cycle of offending and reoffending. So, with that, I do want to thank you for letting me close out Women's History Month by sharing with you some reflections on the woman who was my rocket fuel. I hope our talk today prompts you all to reflect on those women who have been yours.